The advertisement sat on the kitchen table like an accusation. Ada Whitmore stared at it. Her father's handwriting circled around one particular notice in the Livestock Gazette. Of all places, the Livestock Gazette, where ranchers in Texas advertised for horses, seed grain, and apparently, wives. "You circled this," she said. Her father didn't look up from his ledger. The ledger that hadn't balanced in 2 years. "I made inquiries," he said. "The man is respectable." "You made inquiries?" Ada set down the Gazette carefully, the way she'd learned to set down breakable things. "About selling me." Don't be dramatic." In the parlor, she could hear her two sisters laughing about something. Constance, always laughing. Rosalind, always beautiful. And Ada, always adding columns in her head that her father couldn't be bothered to add himself. The columns that told her, clear as arithmetic, that the Whitmore family was 4 months from ruin. She'd known it before he did. That was the problem. She'd always known things before people thought she was capable of knowing them. Her father finally looked up. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not cruelty exactly. Desperation wearing the mask of cruelty, which was somehow worse. "Eli Garnett is a horse rancher in Bexar County," he said. "Widower, son, age 9. He needs a capable woman to manage his household." A pause. "I told him you were experienced with accounts and property management." "And what did you tell him about everything else?" "Everything else?" Ada gestured at herself. Her square jaw, her ink-stained fingers, her dress that had been let out twice because she'd kept growing when it seemed impolite to keep growing. She'd heard the word handsome applied to her exactly once, by a man who immediately clarified he'd meant her horse. As her father looked away, that was answer enough. The letter from Eli Garnett arrived 6 days later. Ada brought it in with the rest of the mail, set it on the table, and stood looking at it for a long time before she opened it. It was not what she expected. "Miss Whitmore," he wrote, "I'll be honest with you because I don't have the patience for games. My ranch is solvent but tight. My son is 9 years old and has not had a woman's steady hand since his mother died. I work from before sunrise until after dark, and I have no talent for the finer points of household management. What I need is a partner in the practical sense of the word. I am not offering romance. I am offering a home, fair treatment, and a share in whatever this ranch becomes. If that is not enough, I understand. But I don't want to waste your time or mine on false impressions. Respectfully, Eli Garnett." Ada read it 3 times. Then she sat down, which wasn't something she normally did in the middle of the afternoon. He hadn't asked what she looked like. He hadn't mentioned expectations about beauty or grace or any of the social performances her sisters handled effortlessly. And she had spent 26 years attempting badly. He'd written like a man who needed something solved, and trusted her to read that plainly. The thing was, she could read things plainly. That was the one talent everyone in her life had consistently underestimated. She wrote back the same evening. She did not mention that she was not precisely what her father had described. She told him she understood accounts, that she had no illusions about ranch work, and that she had no intention of being a burden to anyone. She did not tell her father she'd written until after she'd sent it. His response when it came was not an argument. It was a train ticket. Constance cried. Rosalind said, very quietly, "I always knew you were braver than the rest of us," which was either kind or devastating, and Ada couldn't decide which. Her mother pressed a small Bible into her hands and said nothing at all, which was somehow the most honest farewell of the 3. Ada packed one trunk. She left behind the yellow dress she'd bought in a moment of optimism 3 years ago and never worn. She left behind the earrings her grandmother had given Constance, then Rosalind, then looked past Ada entirely to leave for the youngest girl who'd still be born. She did not feel sorry about this. She felt something more like clarity. The train to San Antonio took 2 days. Ada spent most of it watching Texas unspool outside the window, the land going from soft and green to something harder, more elemental, a landscape that didn't apologize for what it was. She thought she understood something about that. A woman across the aisle, 60-ish, with the bearing of someone who'd outlasted several difficult situations, looked at Ada's trunk and said, "Heading somewhere permanent?" "I think so," Ada said. "Alone?" "Meeting someone." The woman studied her, for a moment with the unsentimental clarity of someone who'd seen many things. "Well," she said finally, "you've got sensible boots. That's more than most of them have." Ada looked down at her boots. She'd bought them specifically for this. She decided to take it as a good sign. Eli Garnett was waiting on the platform at San Antonio. She knew him the moment she stepped off the train, not because he was handsome, though he was, in the severe, weathered way that Texas seemed to produce. But because he was the only man standing completely still, while everyone else moved around him. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. His eyes found her, and stayed there, without the flicker of adjustment she'd grown accustomed to, the moment when men recalculated her against their expectations and came up short. He just looked, like he was simply seeing what was in front of him. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Garnett." A pause. Neither of them seemed compelled to fill it with pleasantries. "Wagons this way," he said. "Reuben's with the horses." She followed him. The boy, Reuben, was 9 years old and small for it, with his father's watchful eyes in a rounder, less guarded face. He looked at Ada with the frank appraisal only children and horses could get away with. "You're not what I thought you'd look like," he said. "Reuben." Eli's voice was quiet but definitive. "It's all right," Ada said. She looked at the boy directly. "What did you think I'd look like?" Reuben considered this with great seriousness. "Softer," he said finally, "like a lady from a painting." "I'm not particularly soft," Ada said, "but I'm told I make good cornbread." Reuben's expression shifted fractionally toward cautious interest. "How good?" "I guess you'll have to tell me." They rode the 12 miles to the Garnett Ranch, in the kind of silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Eli drove. Reuben sat between them, asking Ada periodic questions about Missouri, with the focused curiosity of someone conducting a survey. The landscape opened as they went, mesquite and cedar giving way to long grassland. A pale November sky stretched overhead. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, and Ada, who had been quietly preparing herself to be disappointed, felt something unexpected. It was not grand. The house was solid limestone, 2 stories, built for function rather than impression. The outbuildings were well maintained, the fencing was in good repair, and the land went on in every direction. Not beautiful the way paintings were beautiful, but true in a way that felt more important. "It's good land," she said. Eli looked at her. He had a way of doing that, turning his full attention somewhere and not moving it until he was done. "Most people say it's empty." "Most people can't read land the way they read a balance sheet." Ada watched a hawk circle over the far pasture. "What's your water situation?" Another pause. Something in his expression changed slightly, though she couldn't have named what. "Creek along the south boundary. Dries up 2 months out of 12. "And your nearest neighbors?" "The Pfeiffer family, 3 miles east. Decent people. A beat. And the Aldrich operation, 6 miles north." The way he said Aldrich was the way her father said overdue loan. She filed that away. The house was larger inside than it looked from the road, and it had the particular feeling of a place managed by a man doing his honest best without the right instincts for it, clean enough. Organized in a way that made sense for tools and livestock, but not for a household. Supplies in the wrong places, rooms used for purposes they weren't suited to, the kitchen arranged by someone who'd been improvising for 3 years. Reuben showed her through each room with the proprietary enthusiasm of a child who'd had no one new to show anything to in a long time. He'd saved his own room for last. "I have a collection," he told her, gesturing at 3 shelves of rocks, old coins, and what appeared to be a coyote skull. "I see that. Pa says I need to organize it better." He looked at the shelves. "I don't know how." "What matters most to you in it?" Reuben thought about it. The rocks from the creek, and this. He held up a compass, brass, with a crack in the glass. "Then those go in the center," Ada said. "Everything else arranges around what matters." He looked at the compass, then at her, with an expression she'd seen before. In students who'd just understood something they'd thought was complicated, and found it was simple. It was her favorite expression. Eli appeared in the doorway. "I'll show you your room." It was small, clean, with a window facing east. Someone, him she realized, had put a fresh pitcher of water on the dresser and a lamp with a full reservoir of oil. Practical kindnesses offered without performance. "Supper's at 6, he said. "Rank hands eat in the bunkhouse. It's just us 3 at the table." "All right." He started to leave, then stopped. Didn't turn around. "My foreman will tell you I run a good operation," he said. "He'd be right, but I want you to know that I know it's hard out here. If you find it isn't what you thought." "Mr. Garnett." He stopped. "I knew it would be hard," Ada said. "That's the only part I was certain of before I came." A long pause. Then he left without another word, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders. She stayed up until midnight, going through the household accounts that first week, and what she found made her very still. Eli Garnett was not a careless man. His ranch records were meticulous. Cattle counts, feed costs, water schedules, all of it tracked in a neat economical hand. But there were gaps. Not errors, exactly. Gaps. Consistent gaps between what his foreman Hector Vance reported selling at market and what Ada could calculate the cattle should have yielded at current prices. She added the numbers 4 different ways. The answer was the same each time. Someone was skimming. Not dramatically, not the kind of theft that announced itself. The patient, careful kind, the kind that assumed no one was looking closely enough to catch it. Ada looked closely enough. That was what she did. She didn't tell Eli immediately. She spent 2 more weeks verifying, pulling invoices, cross-referencing with the feed store ledger she'd asked to borrow under the pretext of organizing their supply orders. She built her case the way she'd watched her father fail to build anything, piece by piece, number by number, until the picture was undeniable. In the meantime, she learned the ranch. She learned that Reuben was smarter than his schoolmaster knew, and bored in ways that made him difficult. She started spending an hour each evening going over his lessons with him, and discovered he could calculate in his head faster than she could on paper. She started teaching him to use that. She learned that the Mexican cook, Señora Peralta, had been running the household's food stores on a budget so tight it had become a point of personal honor, and greeted Ada's suggestions about bulk orders and preservation with the wariness of someone who'd seen too many new brides reorganize what didn't need reorganizing. Ada spent 3 weeks asking rather than suggesting, and then one morning Señora Peralta appeared at her elbow and said, "The dried beans from the co-op. It's cheaper than the store. You were right." After that they worked well together. She learned that Eli rose at 4:30, came in for coffee at 6:30, spoke no unnecessary words before 8, and was not unkind but had the emotional accessibility of the limestone walls he'd built his house from. And she learned, slowly, that he watched her, not in a way she could call inappropriate, more the way a man watches something he's trying to figure out whether he can trust. She understood that. She was watching him the same way. On a Friday evening, in December, she laid the accounts on the kitchen table after Reuben was asleep. Eli sat across from her and went through the numbers twice without speaking. "Vance," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How long?" "I believe at least 3 years. Possibly, since his wife's illness. I think he needed money and started small and couldn't find a way to stop." Eli's jaw was tight. He'd hired Vance 12 years ago. She could see what that meant to him. "You're certain?" "I can show you how I arrived at every number." "I believe you." He was quiet a moment. "How much?" She told him. She watched the calculation move across his face, watched him absorb it. "I would have lost this ranch," he said. Not to her exactly, to the fact of it. Not immediately, but within 2 seasons, if prices dipped, yes. He stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the Texas dark was complete, and the stars were the kind that didn't exist back east. "You came here 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes. And you found what I've had a foreman for 12 years. Ada said nothing. There wasn't much to say. He turned around. In the lamplight, his face was unreadable. But she'd gotten better at Eli Garnett over the past weeks, and she thought she could see something moving underneath the surface of him. Something that wasn't anger, though it was adjacent to it. "Thank you," he said. "That's not enough of a word, but it's what I have." "What will you do about Vance?" "I'll handle it tomorrow, properly." His eyes met hers. "You should know. His wife's sick. I won't destroy a man's family for this, but he's done here." Ada nodded slowly. She hadn't expected that. She found she respected it considerably. She was in the garden 3 days after Vance left, a sad patch of winter sparse ground that she'd decided to rehabilitate in spring, when a man on a very expensive black horse came up the drive. He was the kind of man who understood exactly how he looked on an expensive black horse. Silver at the temples, well-dressed for the middle of a Tuesday, with a smile that arrived before anything else about him. "Mrs. Garnett," he said, because she'd been introduced to the county that way, and people had stopped correcting it. "Silas Aldrich, I've been meaning to welcome you properly." She pulled off her gardening gloves and studied him, 6 miles north. "How kind," she said. He dismounted with the ease of someone who spent money to make things easy. "I wanted to offer my sympathies about your foreman situation. Word travels in a county this small." His tone was warm, regretful. Vance was a good man. It's always hard to lose someone you've trusted. Ada said. I also wanted to mention, in the spirit of neighborliness, a pause that was slightly too long, that I've made Eli an offer on this property before, a fair one. And if things become difficult, as they sometimes do after this sort of disruption, I'd hate to see a young couple struggle unnecessarily. Ada looked at him. She thought about the Whitmore household ledger she'd watched her father ignore for 2 years. She thought about the way men offered help in the tone of inevitability, as though the help was already decided and only the formalities remained. That's very generous, she said. I'll tell my husband a neighbor stopped to offer condolences. Something tightened behind Aldrich's smile. Of course, please do. After he rode away, Ada went back to her garden and knelt back down in the dirt and thought for a very long time about water rights and market access and the geography of a county where one man owned 6 miles of land to the north. She thought about numbers. She was always thinking about numbers. That evening she said to Eli, "Tell me about Aldrich." He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on blade steady and unhurried, he told her. The Aldrich family had been in Bexar County since before the war. Silas had expanded methodically, buying up struggling operations, always below value, always with that same neighborly regret. He controlled 2 of the 3 roads to the main rail depot. He can't touch us directly, Eli said. Our land deed is clean. No, Ada said, but he can squeeze the margins. Freight rates, market access, supply costs from the co-op if he buys enough stake there. She looked at him. He's not after your land. He's after your leverage to keep yours. Eli set down the knife. He looked at her in the way she'd come to recognize. The way that meant he was adjusting something in his understanding. You figured this out today, he said. He came this afternoon to remind me the offer exists. He wanted me to be frightened. Are you? Ada considered the question honestly. I'm angry, she said. That's more useful. For the first time, the first real time, not the half-breath version she'd seen before, Eli Garnett smiled. It changed his face completely. It was the kind of smile that had been rationed so carefully it still meant something. All right, he said. Then let's be angry together. What do you need? What she needed was the records from every ranch Aldrich had acquired in the last decade, and a good attorney who understood land contract law. And 3 weeks she spent writing letters and calling in the single favor she had from a law school friend of her father's in Austin. She found a pattern in the acquisitions, a particular clause in 3 of the purchase agreements that had been, she believed, fraudulently induced. Not enough to bring Aldrich down, but enough to give 2 families leverage to renegotiate, enough to matter to those 2 families. Enough to make it clear to Aldrich that someone in Bexar County was now paying attention. His next offer on the Garnett property did not come. Winter broke slowly into spring. The garden came up, not beautifully, not yet, but honestly, the way things come up when the ground is finally ready. Reuben helped her plant it on a Saturday and talked the entire time about the geology of creek gravel, which Ada found unexpectedly interesting, and she told him so. Pa says I talk too much about rocks, Reuben said. Your father, Ada said, has many admirable qualities, and appreciating geology is not one of them. Reuben burst out laughing. It was such an uncomplicated sound. She realized she'd been working toward it, without knowing that's what she was doing. That evening, Eli found her on the porch as the sun went down in the particular extravagant way it did in Texas, as though the sky was making a point. Reuben told me what you said about the geology, he said. I stand by it. He sat down in the other chair, and for a few minutes they were both quiet, watching the light change. I want to tell you something, he said finally. All right. When your father wrote to me, he described you as experienced with estate management and property accounts. A pause. He didn't mention much else. Ada kept her eyes on the horizon. No, I don't expect he did. I had a clear picture in my mind of who was coming. Eli was quiet a moment. It was wrong, not wrong badly, just incomplete. She turned to look at him then. He was looking at the sky the way he sometimes looked at problems. The same total, unhurried attention. I came here knowing your father misrepresented things too, she said. I didn't correct his letter. I needed to leave. I know. He turned to look at her. I figured that out about 2 days after you arrived. And I was glad you came. He said it plainly the way he said things, without ornamentation. I don't know how to say things the way they're supposed to be said. Sarah, my wife, she used to tell me I had the emotional range of a fence post. She wasn't entirely wrong, Ada said. He almost smiled. No, a beat. But I want you to know what you've done here. The accounts, Vance, the Aldrich business. You saved this ranch. You saved Reuben's future. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that. Ada looked at her hands, still rough from the garden. I came here to be useful, she said quietly. That's what I told myself. But it's become something more than that. Has it? It wasn't quite a question. I didn't expect to feel at home somewhere, she said. I wasn't sure I was the kind of person places happen to. What does that mean? It means I spent 26 years being the one who managed things while the places happened to everyone else. She paused. Constance gets engaged to a man who builds her a house. Rosalind gets invited to every party in the county. I balance the ledger so there's money for the parties. She looked at him. I was useful, but I wasn't anywhere. Eli was quiet for a moment, then, "You're here." "Yes." "And when you found Vance's theft, when you went to the mat for those families with Aldrich, when Reuben laughs at the dinner table." He stopped. "Where were you then?" Ada felt something catch in her throat. "Here," she said.
Right.
He reached over and put his hand over hers, rough on rough. He didn't squeeze it, just held it like a fact. "You're here, Ada. This is where you are." They sat like that until the stars came out. A month later, on a Sunday after church, the church where the women had initially assessed Ada with the practiced efficiency of an appraisal and arrived at an underwhelming valuation, something shifted. It shifted because Reuben, who had no social instincts and therefore no capacity for social dissembling, announced to Mrs. Brower and her daughter that Ada had figured out a man was stealing from his father and saved the whole ranch. Ada had not told anyone this. Eli had not told anyone this. Reuben had told absolutely everyone. By the following Sunday, the appraisal had been revised. It was small, this revision. A few women who'd previously looked through her now looked at her. Margaret Sealer, whose husband had been one of the families tangled in Aldrich's contracts, found Ada after the service and took her hand with a pressure that said something words weren't needed for. Reverend Capp stopped her at the door and said, in the direct way of men who spent their lives among difficult realities, "We're glad you're here, Mrs. Garnett." It was the first time she'd heard her name said with weight in it, with meaning. Not Garnett the borrowed name, not Mrs. the social formality, but the whole of it together, as a designation that meant something in this place. She didn't cry. She was not much given to crying, but she held on to it. That evening, Reuben asked her to help him build a proper display case for his collection. They worked on it in the kitchen for 2 hours, Eli reading in the next room, occasionally offering a sardonic comment about the structural integrity of their carpentry. "Pa's good at building things," Reuben told her, in the confiding tone he used when he'd decided she could be trusted with information. "He's just not good at saying he wants to build them." "Is that so?" "Yeah." Reuben fitted a small piece of wood into its notch with concentration. "He built the shelves in your room before you came. He didn't tell you that, right?" Ada thought of the room, waiting for her. The lamp with the full reservoir, the shelves, solid and well-fitted against the wall. "No," she said, "he didn't." Reuben nodded like this confirmed something. "That's Pa," he said simply. She found Eli on the back porch after Reuben went to bed. The night was warm enough now to stand in, the first real warmth of the year. "Reuben told me about the shelves," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted the room to be right before you got here." "Why?" "Because," he stopped, started again. "Because you were coming to a stranger's house, and someone should make it feel like it was ready for you." Ada stood next to him at the porch rail, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have to, not because there's nowhere else." She looked at the dark land, the stars over Texas, the garden she was growing at the edge of the yard. "Because this is mine now, if you'll have that." Eli turned to look at her, fully the way he did things, nothing held back. "I wrote 17 letters," he said. "Responses to the advertisement. Yours was the only one that didn't tell me what I wanted to hear." "I didn't know what you wanted to hear." "I know." He looked at her like she was a problem he'd solved and was still slightly amazed by the answer. "That was why I picked yours." He kissed her then, which he did the way he did everything, without excess, without performance, with a kind of concentrated honesty that made everything else in her life, every apology she'd ever made for existing, feel very far away. Later, much later, Reuben appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, sleepy and accusatory. "You're still up," he said. "So are you," Ada pointed out. He considered this, found it reasonable, and went back to bed without further comment. Spring turned to summer. The garden became real, with actual vegetables that Senora Peralta approved of, and said so in the limited way she said things she approved of. The ranch accounts balanced cleanly for the first time in years. Reuben won a spelling competition at school and attributed it to Ada's tutoring, with a specificity that caused her some embarrassment and him considerable pride. The county adjusted itself around Eli Garnett the way places eventually do when a person stops asking permission to matter and simply matters. Not dramatically, incrementally, the way good things usually work. And Eli, who had built shelves for a woman he'd never met because he thought someone ought to, continued doing the things he couldn't say in words. He brought her the first wild bluebonnets in March. He asked her opinion on the fall cattle plan and argued with her half the afternoon, and then did mostly what she'd suggested. He learned, slowly, to say things before circumstances forced it. One evening, near the end of summer, Ada stood at the kitchen window, watching Eli and Reuben work with a young horse in the corral. Reuben was talking the entire time, as he always did. Eli was listening, as he always did, with the full attention he gave to things worth listening to. She'd left Missouri with one trunk and the absolute certainty that her value to anyone had always been functional. She had not expected this. She was not sure she had known to expect it. Margaret Seiler found her at the co-op the following week and said, "I heard your family back east is asking after you, wanting to know how it turned out." "I expect they are," Ada said. "What would you tell them?" Ada thought about her father's ledger, the Livestock Gazette, the train ticket, pressed into her hands like a problem solved. She thought about shelves that had been built before she arrived. She thought about a boy who talked too much about rocks and a man who said everything except the things that mattered most. And somehow both of them had made room for her before they'd even decided to. "I'd tell them," she said, "that it turned out I was the right kind of person for the right kind of place. I just had to go find it." She had not been the daughter they'd wanted. She had not been the wife anyone had imagined. She had been, her entire life, the one who saw what was actually in the room when everyone else was looking somewhere prettier. It turned out that was exactly enough. I keep thinking about that Livestock Gazette. Of all the places a person's future could hinge on, a Livestock Gazette, circled in a father's handwriting, tucked next to bills and feed orders like she was inventory. And maybe that's the part that stays with me most. Not the cruelty of it exactly, but the smallness. The way people can reduce someone to a line item without ever meaning to be monstrous. They just stop looking carefully. And when you stop looking carefully at a person, you stop seeing them at all. Ada had been unseen for 26 years. Not hated, not mistreated in any dramatic way. Just looked past. The way your eyes slide over something that doesn't catch the light the right way. Her sisters caught the light. Ada balanced the books so there was money for the candles. What I find myself sitting with is this. The things that made her invisible in one place were exactly the things that saved everything in another. Her father thought her talent for numbers was a selling point to dress up a transaction. Eli Garnett discovered it meant his ranch would survive. There's a kind of justice in that, but it's not the easy kind. It didn't arrive because the universe owed her. It arrived because she showed up and did the work, and refused to pretend she was less than she was, even when that would have been the quieter choice. That takes something most people underestimate in themselves. It's not just grit, though Lord knows she had that, sitting up until midnight with a stranger's ledgers, building a case number by number, finding the theft that a 12-year foreman had hidden for 3 years. It's something quieter than grit. It's the willingness to keep trusting what you know, even when no one around you has ever confirmed that what you know matters. And then there's Eli, a man who built shelves for a woman he'd never met because he thought the room should be ready for her. He never said that. He just did it. I think about that a lot. The difference between people who announce their goodness and people who just practice it, quietly, in the form of a full oil lamp and a window facing east. He made mistakes. He hired the wrong man and trusted him too long. But when Ada laid the evidence on the table, he didn't argue with it. Didn't protect his pride over his family's future. He listened. That's its own kind of integrity, the kind that's harder than it looks. Reuben is the part of this story that undoes me a little. A 9-year-old with a coyote skull collection and a head full of creek geology, reaching for someone to tell him that what he loves has value. Ada saw that in about 4 minutes. She told him the things that mattered most should go in the center. He's going to carry that his whole life. We don't always know which moments are the ones that shape a person. We just try to be honest in them. What I take from all of it is something I'm still learning to believe. That the qualities that get you overlooked in one room can be the exact qualities that hold everything together in the next one. Integrity isn't loud. Real intelligence often looks like patience. And the kind of strength that lasts isn't the kind that announces itself. It's the kind that shows up on a Tuesday and reads the numbers nobody else bothered to read, and doesn't stop until it finds the truth. Ada wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was waiting to be somewhere that let her be fully what she already was. That's not a small thing. That's everything.